June 4, 1943, Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil trembled slightly as Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt wrote in his hidden diary, recording words that would have earned him solitary confinement if discovered by his own officers. The Texas heat pressed through the train windows like a living thing, heavy and humid, so different from the dry African desert where he'd been captured just 3 weeks prior. Around him, 300 German soldiers of the Afrika Korps sat in cushioned seats, actual cushioned seats, their sun-bleached uniforms still bearing the dust of Tunisia, their minds reeling from a reality that defied every piece of propaganda they'd consumed for the past decade. The train wheels clicked rhythmically against the rails, a metallic heartbeat carrying them deeper into enemy territory, yet the enemy seemed to have forgotten they were enemies at all. Through the window, Burkhardt watched American farmhouses flash by, each one illuminated despite the approaching dusk, electric lights blazing defiantly against the gathering darkness. In Germany, his mother hadn't seen an electric light burn freely since 1940. Blackout regulations had plunged the entire Reich into mandatory darkness the moment the sun set. Here, in the heart of a nation supposedly crippled by decadent democracy and racial mixing, light poured from windows as carelessly as water from a tap. "This cannot be real," he wrote, the German words flowing across the page in cramped, careful script. "They want us to believe America is wealthy. Yes, but this is impossible. No nation fighting on 2 fronts, no nation stretched across 2 oceans could possess such abundance. They must be showing us selected routes, propaganda villages, like the Führer did with the Red Cross delegations." But even as his pencil formed these rationalizations, his eyes betrayed him, drinking in details that accumulated like evidence at a crime scene. The train itself was wrong, all wrong. Not cattle cars with straw on the floor, not the freight wagons they'd used to transport French prisoners in 1940, but a proper passenger train with upholstered seats, clean windows, and most impossibly a dining car, where Negro porters in crisp white uniforms were preparing to serve them dinner. Actual dinner. With plates and cutlery. His stomach, trained by 3 years of war to expect nothing and be grateful for scraps, churned with confused anticipation. Through the window, he caught glimpses of automobiles on the parallel highway, dozens of them, civilians driving freely, despite wartime fuel rationing that had removed private vehicles from German roads since 1941. Each detail was a small betrayal of everything Joseph Goebbels had promised them about American weakness, each observation a crack in the ideological armor that had sustained them through the African campaign. What none of them knew not, Burkhardt, not the stone-faced Oberst sitting 3 rows ahead, still wearing his Iron Cross, not the youngest soldiers who'd been 16 when they'd joined the Wehrmacht, was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological transformation in modern POW history. They were unwitting participants in an unplanned experiment in soft power, a systematic demolition of Nazi ideology accomplished not through Soviet-style re-education camps or British interrogation techniques, but through the simple, devastating display of American abundance. The U.S. military, whether by design or fortune, had stumbled upon a truth more powerful than any propaganda. You could break a man's worldview more effectively with kindness and plenty than with cruelty and deprivation. The collapse of the Afrika Korps had begun on May 13, 1943, when General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the last Axis forces in North Africa. But the collapse of these soldiers' beliefs would unfold over months of cognitive dissonance so severe that many would never recover their original convictions. As the train rolled through the Texas evening, carrying its cargo of confused warriors toward camps that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies, their cause, and themselves, Burkhardt felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of certainty that felt simultaneously like relief and terror. The pencil in his hand stopped trembling as he wrote his final line for the evening. "I am beginning to think we have been told lies. But if these are lies, then what else have they lied about? What else?" Outside, the American lights continued to burn, each one a small star in a constellation of doubt that was just beginning to form in 300 German minds. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle plans or tank production figures, but in the mundane details that greeted German prisoners at every turn. When Burkhardt's transport arrived at Camp Hearn, Texas, on that sweltering June evening, the first shock wasn't the barbed wire or guard towers those were expected, even comforting in their familiarity. It was the grass. Actual cultivated grass, green and manicured, growing in decorative patches around administrative buildings in the middle of a military installation. In Germany, every available patch of earth had been converted to victory gardens since 1941. Decorative lawns were a decadent memory of peacetime. Yet here, in a prison camp, Americans wasted water and labor on purely aesthetic vegetation. The camp commandant, Colonel Michael Durant, had even installed flower beds, petunias and marigolds, blooming obscenely in the Texas heat, while German cities scraped moss from trees to make soup. The arriving prisoners stumbled from the trains like men entering an alternate dimension, their desert-scorched eyes trying to process scenes that Goebbels had assured them were impossible. Electric lights illuminated the entire compound, not just the guard posts, but the barracks, the mess hall, the recreation areas. In Germany, his mother read by candlelight, to save fuel for the war effort. Here, electricity flowed so freely that prisoners could read until midnight if they chose. The barracks themselves delivered the second shock. Real beds with metal frames and actual mattresses, not straw ticks on wooden platforms. Clean sheets, white sheets that appeared to be washed regularly. 2 blankets per man, wool blankets without holes or lice. Each barrack had flush toilets and running water. Hot water for showers 3 times a week. Burkhardt remembered his last months in Africa, where they'd rationed water by the capful, where men had killed each other over canteens. His fellow prisoner, Gefreiter Hans Müller, stood frozen in the doorway of their assigned quarters, physically unable to cross the threshold. "It's nicer than my family's apartment in Hamburg," he whispered, and Burkhardt knew he wasn't exaggerating. The Hamburg working-class districts had been cramped and dim even before the British bombing raids began. Each barrack housed 50 men in more space and comfort than most German soldiers had known in civilian life. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and visceral. They were prisoners, defeated enemies, yet they were being housed better than their own army had housed them as victors in France. But nothing, not the lights, not the beds, not the grass prepared them for the mess hall. That first evening, as 300 members of the Afrika Korps lined up with metal trays, they encountered a reality that would haunt their dreams and their letters home for years to come. Meat. Actual beef, not stringy horsemeat or suspicious sausage of uncertain origin, but recognizable cuts of beef in brown gravy. Potatoes, white potatoes, not turnips disguised as potatoes. Fresh bread, white bread, not the sawdust-extended black bread that had become standard in Germany since 1942. Butter, real butter stamped with American dairy marks. Coffee that actually tasted like coffee, not the burnt barley and acorn substitute that Germans had been drinking for 3 years. And the portions, good God, the portions. The American servers, German-speaking prisoners who'd arrived months earlier, ladled food onto plates with a casualness that suggested this was normal, every day, unremarkable. "Take more if you're still hungry," one of them said to Burkhardt, who stood paralyzed with his tray, unable to process the sentence. Take more? In the Afrika Korps, they'd counted individual crackers, rationed water by the spoonful. His last meal in German hands had been a handful of dried dates and a cup of sandy water. Around him, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front and the African campaign were crying. Not dramatically, not openly, but tears sliding down sunburnt faces as they sat at actual tables with actual chairs, eating food that their families hadn't seen in years. The camp authorities had made a critical error in their kindness. They'd allowed the prisoners to write home immediately, and those first letters would become documents of devastating revelation. "Dear Mother," Burkhardt wrote that night, his stomach full for the first time in months. "I am safe and well treated. Please do not worry. We have enough food here." He wanted to write more, wanted to describe the beef and butter and electric lights, but the internal censor stopped him. How could he tell his mother, subsisting on turnip soup and black bread in bombed-out Berlin, that her captured son was eating better than she had in 5 years? How could he explain that the Americans, portrayed as mongrel barbarians corrupted by Jewish influence, were treating Wehrmacht prisoners with more humanity than the Wehrmacht had shown to anyone? The accumulation of evidence continued relentlessly. The camp library, stocked with German classics alongside American magazines, the sports equipment, soccer balls, volleyballs, even tennis rackets. The camp store where prisoners could purchase cigarettes, chocolate, and writing materials with the 80 cents a day they earned from voluntary labor. 80 cents that had actual purchasing power, unlike the increasingly worthless Reichsmarks back home. Some prisoners found work on local farms, riding in trucks past endless fields of cotton, corn, and wheat, past herds of cattle that hadn't been requisitioned for the war effort, past farmhouses where families sat on porches listening to radios. Everyone had radios playing music instead of endless propaganda broadcasts. The evidence mounted day by day, meal by meal, observation by observation, until the weight of it crushed whatever remained of their pre-war certainties. They were prisoners in enemy territory, yet they lived better, ate better, and were treated better than they had been as free men in Hitler's Germany. The question that haunted the barracks at night, whispered in darkness despite the electric lights available at the flip of a switch, was devastating in its simplicity. If Americans could provide all this for enemy prisoners while fighting a global war, what else had Berlin lied about? The denial came in waves, each more desperate than the last. For the first 2 weeks at Camp Herne, Burkhardt and his fellow prisoners constructed elaborate psychological defenses against the reality surrounding them. "This is all a show," insisted Hauptmann Friedrich Kessel during a clandestine meeting in Barrack 7, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded a panzer unit at Gazala. "The Americans are clever propagandists. They fatten us up, take photographs, and show the world how well they treat prisoners while their bombers destroy our cities. When the International Red Cross leaves, you'll see the real treatment will begin." The other officers nodded, eager to grasp any explanation that preserved their worldview. They theorized that Camp Herne was a special showcase facility, that other camps must be places of starvation and brutality. They convinced themselves that the abundance was temporary, that America would soon exhaust itself maintaining such luxury. "No nation can sustain this," Kessel insisted. "In 3 months, 6 months maximum, their economy will collapse from the strain." But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed him, unconsciously tracking the Negro soldiers who delivered fresh supplies every morning, trucks laden with more food than his unit had seen in their final 3 months in Africa. The rationalizations grew increasingly strained as letters arrived from other camps across America. Burkhardt's cousin Wilhelm wrote from Camp Campbell in Kentucky, describing identical conditions, the same abundant food, the same recreational facilities, the same bewildering kindness from guards and civilians alike. Letters from Camp Forest in Tennessee, Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Carson in Colorado, all told the same impossible story. There were 425,000 German prisoners scattered across America by late 1943, and every one of them was eating beef while their families subsisted on sawdust bread. The mathematics didn't work. If this was propaganda, it was propaganda on a scale that defied comprehension. The cognitive dissonance manifested physically: headaches, insomnia, a persistent nausea that had nothing to do with the rich food. Burkhardt found himself performing mental gymnastics to maintain his beliefs. "Perhaps America is sacrificing its own civilians to maintain this show," he wrote in his diary, then crossed it out, knowing how absurd it sounded. Through the fence, he could see American civilians driving past in private automobiles, their children eating ice cream cones in the Texas heat. No nation prioritized enemy prisoners over its own people, except apparently, incomprehensibly, America did. The camp's work program accelerated the psychological erosion. Prisoners who volunteered for agricultural labor, and most did, from sheer boredom if nothing else, found themselves thrust into the heart of American abundance. Burkhardt was assigned to a cotton farm owned by Jim Patterson, a laconic Texan who treated the German POWs with the same rough kindness he showed his Mexican laborers. The first morning, Patterson's wife Clara served them breakfast eggs, bacon, biscuits with gravy, orange juice that had somehow traveled from Florida to Texas in refrigerated train cars. She served enemy prisoners the same breakfast she served her own farmhands, apologizing that the coffee wasn't stronger. "War rationing," she explained, and Burkhardt almost laughed at the American definition of rationing slightly weaker coffee, while Germans were brewing substitute from acorns and burnt grain. Working in Patterson's fields, he witnessed an agricultural abundance that mocked everything he'd been told about American decadence and inefficiency. Mechanical harvesters that did the work of dozens of men. Irrigation systems that turned desert into farmland. Trucks, tractors, and automobiles everywhere, burning gasoline as if oil were water. The farm's Negro workers drove their own vehicles in Nazi Germany. Even owning a bicycle required special permits. By August, the denials were becoming harder to maintain. "I can no longer pretend this is temporary," Burkhardt confided to Muller one evening as they played chess in the recreation hall. Around them, prisoners were reading American newspapers, uncensored, available in the library, playing ping-pong, listening to a radio broadcasting swing music from Dallas. Every day I work on that farm, I see the truth. They have so much they can afford to be generous with enemies. We were told America was weak, mongrelized, corrupted by democracy and racial mixing. But I've seen more order, more prosperity, more simple human decency here as a prisoner than I ever saw as a free man in the Reich. Müller moved his knight, avoiding Burkhardt's eyes. Careful, Werner. Such thoughts are dangerous. But even Müller couldn't maintain his ideological armor much longer. That same week, he'd received a letter from his wife in Hamburg, describing their son's Hitler Youth uniform patches, sewn over patches, boots stuffed with newspaper because leather was reserved for the front. Meanwhile, Müller played soccer in the camp yard, wearing proper athletic shoes provided by the Americans. The breaking point came differently for each man. For Burkhardt, it was a simple moment in late August when Patterson's 8-year-old daughter, Jenny, offered him a Hershey bar while he repaired a fence. She wasn't supposed to talk to the prisoners, but children ignore such rules. "My daddy says you have kids back in Germany," she said, blue eyes curious rather than fearful. "Do they like chocolate?" The innocence of the question shattered something in Burkhardt's chest. His own daughter, Greta, was 7. He hadn't seen chocolate since 1941. This American child, whose nation was fighting a war on 2 fronts, could casually give away chocolate to an enemy prisoner. The chocolate bar weighed nothing in his hand but felt like the weight of an entire civilization, a civilization that could afford such casual kindness, such thoughtless abundance. That night, he stopped writing rationalizations in his diary. He stopped trying to explain away what he saw. He simply wrote, "We have lost. Not just the war, we have lost the argument. A nation that can treat its enemies better than we treated ourselves has already won in every way that matters." The realization brought not despair but an unexpected relief, like finally setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its burden. Around him, in Camp Herne, hundreds of other German soldiers were reaching similar conclusions, each in their own time, their own way. The ideological fortress of National Socialism, crumbling not under Allied bombs, but under the devastating weapon of American grocery stores. The collective breakthrough came on the 9th of September, 1943, when news of Italy's surrender reached Camp Herne during the evening meal. The mess hall, usually filled with the comfortable murmur of 500 men eating, fell silent as Colonel Durant himself entered to make the announcement. "Gentlemen," he said in careful German, "I thought you should hear this from me. Your ally, Italy, has signed an armistice with the Allied forces. Marshal Badoglio has ordered all Italian forces to cease hostilities." The silence that followed was profound. But it wasn't the silence of shock, it was the silence of recognition. Every man in that hall had been watching American industrial might for months, had been eating American abundance, had been witnessing a society so wealthy it could afford to be magnanimous to its enemies. Italy's surrender wasn't a betrayal, it was an acknowledgement of reality. Burkhardt watched as Oberst Hermann Kleist, the senior German officer in the camp, slowly set down his fork laden with meatloaf and mashed potatoes that would have been a feast in Berlin and said quietly, "So it begins. Not the traitors, or the cowards. Just a simple acknowledgement that the unraveling they'd all sensed was now official." What happened next would be recorded in American military archives as one of the most extraordinary moments in POW history. Spontaneous applause rippled through the mess hall. German soldiers, Wehrmacht veterans who'd sworn personal oaths to Adolf Hitler, were applauding the collapse of the Axis alliance. The transformation wasn't limited to Camp Herne. Across America, in 511 camps, housing 371,683 German prisoners by October 1943, similar scenes were playing out. The statistics told a story that no propaganda could refute. German POWs were gaining weight at an average of 15 pounds in their first 3 months of captivity. The U.S. military was spending $0.95 per day per prisoner on food alone, more than the Wehrmacht spent on its own soldiers in the field. The camps reported virtually no escape attempts after the first 6 months. Why escape from conditions better than home? At Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners had constructed an elaborate theatre where they performed Goethe and Schiller to audiences of American guards who didn't understand a word but attended anyway. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, German POWs were teaching automotive repair to local civilians because they had more experience with machinery than rural Alabamans. The reversals were surreal. almost comedic, if they hadn't been so psychologically devastating to the prisoners' worldview. Letters home became exercises in creative omission. "We are well treated," they wrote, unable to admit they were living better as prisoners than as free men, unable to describe abundance to families subsisting on turnips and ersatz coffee. The most profound reversal came through the re-education program, though not in the way American authorities had planned. The U.S. military had established elaborate curricula to democratize German prisoners, with lectures on American history, civics, and democratic values. But the formal programs were unnecessary. Daily life in America was the most effective propaganda imaginable. When prisoners were transported to work sites, they passed through American towns, untouched by war. No bomb craters, no burned buildings, no rubble women clearing debris. They saw American factories operating at full capacity, while German industrial plants were being reduced to twisted metal by Allied bombers. They witnessed American newspapers criticizing Roosevelt freely, openly, without the writers disappearing in the night. At Camp Hearn, Burkhardt was assigned to translate American newspaper articles for fellow prisoners. On October 15, he translated a Dallas Morning News editorial that Savage criticized Roosevelt's war strategy. In Germany, he told his barracks that evening, the writer would already be in Dachau. Here, it's on the front page. The room fell silent as 30 men grappled with the implications. If Americans could criticize their leader during wartime and remain free, if opposition wasn't treason, then what did that say about everything they'd been taught about the necessity of totalitarian unity? By November 1943, the camp authorities were documenting an unprecedented phenomenon. German POWs were volunteering information about Nazi atrocities, not under interrogation but in casual conversation, as if confession might somehow reconcile the Germany they'd fought for with the America they were experiencing. Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann told his work supervisor about executing Soviet commissars on the Eastern Front, then broke down crying, saying, "We were told they were subhuman, but you Americans treat us, your enemies, better than we treated anyone." The camp psychiatrist, Major David Rosenberg, himself a Jewish refugee from Vienna, reported that dozens of prisoners were experiencing what he termed ideological collapse disorder, a complete breakdown of their belief system, accompanied by severe depression and disorientation. The cure, ironically, was more exposure to American life. Prisoners who worked on farms, who interacted with American civilians, who witnessed democracy in practice, recovered faster than those who remained in camp. The medicine for their psychological wounds was the very society they'd been trained to despise. The numbers were staggering. By December 1943, over 15,000 German POWs had formally requested to remain in America after the war. They were willing to abandon homeland, family, everything, rather than return to what they now understood was a dying, deluded Reich. The U.S. State Department, overwhelmed by applications, had to create special procedures to handle the requests. At Camp Hearn, Burkhardt helped fellow prisoners fill out immigration forms, translating their desperate pleas to remain in the country they'd come to destroy. "I have seen the future here," wrote Unteroffizier Paul Richter, "and I know Germany has already lost it." The twist that nobody had anticipated was that America's greatest victory wasn't measured in captured territory or destroyed divisions, but in the voluntary defection of enemy souls. The POWs hadn't just been captured, they'd been converted. In his diary, Burkhardt wrote, "We came as warriors of the master race. We remain as applicants for American citizenship. The war is over, but not in the way Berlin imagines. We haven't just lost, we've changed sides." 20 years later, in 1963, Werner Burkhardt stood in his appliance store in Houston, Texas, helping a young black couple select their first refrigerator. The irony wasn't lost on him, a former Wehrmacht soldier who'd fought for racial supremacy, now running a successful business in integrated America, counting among his closest friends the very people Nazi ideology had deemed subhuman. "When I was captured," he would tell his American-born children years later, "I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was beginning. Camp Hearn didn't just imprison my body, it liberated my mind." His story wasn't unique. Of the 425,000 German POWs held in America during World War II, an estimated 50,000 formally applied to return, and thousands more did so informally in the decades following the war. They became farmers in Iowa, mechanics in Detroit, shopkeepers in Texas. They married American women, raised American children, and lived out the American dream they'd once been sent to destroy. Burckhardt's own transformation was complete when, in 1955, he sponsored his former barracks mate Hans Müller's immigration to America. Müller, who'd returned to Hamburg in 1946 to find his family dead and his city in ruins, had spent 9 years saving money for passage back to the country that had treated him better as a prisoner than Germany ever had as a citizen. The letters home from German POWs, carefully preserved in American military archives and German family collections, reveal the true scope of this psychological revolution. "I cannot return to Germany," wrote Hauptmann Friedrich Kessel to his sister in 1945. "Not because I fear punishment, but because I fear the poverty of spirit I now know exists there. Here I have seen what humans can accomplish when they build instead of destroy, when they include instead of exclude." Strategic Bombing Survey, conducting post-war interviews in Germany, discovered that returned POWs were often the strongest voices against any resumption of hostilities. They'd seen American industrial capacity firsthand, had lived within its abundance, and knew that Germany could no more defeat America than a child could defeat an adult. But more than military impossibility, they'd experienced a different way of life, one that made the sacrifices demanded by totalitarianism seem not noble but absurd. When denazification programs struggled to change hearts and minds in occupied Germany, the 375,000 returned POWs became inadvertent ambassadors for democracy, their stories of American plenty more convincing than any propaganda broadcast. The program's success was so complete that it created unexpected problems. By 1946, the U.S. military was struggling to repatriate German prisoners who didn't want to leave. Camp Hirn's final holdouts weren't transferred until 1947, and even then, several attempted to escape into American society rather than board ships for Europe. The economic impact was equally surprising. German POWs had harvested 10% of America's agricultural production in 1944 and 1945, their labor helping feed both America and war-torn Europe. They'd built roads, bridges, and buildings that still stood decades later. In Texas alone, POW labor contributed an estimated $70 million to the wartime economy. But the psychological impact dwarfed these material contributions. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be fed and housed according to the standards of the capturing nation's own forces. But America had interpreted this generously, treating enemies better than most nations treated allies. This humanitarian excess, born from abundance rather than strategy, had accomplished something bombs never could. It had changed minds. The historical implications rippled through decades. When the Cold War began, America possessed 375,000 German men who'd experienced American life firsthand and rejected totalitarianism not through coercion, but through comparison. Many became vocal opponents of Soviet communism, having learned to recognize and reject authoritarian propaganda. In 1948, during the Berlin airlift, former POW Wilhelm Schmidt worked as a translator for the U.S. Air Force, telling his American commander, "You fed me when I was your enemy. How could I not help you now that you're feeding my city?" The Marshall Plan's success owed much to returned POWs who assured skeptical Germans that American aid came without imperial ambitions they knew because they'd experienced American generosity when they'd had nothing to offer in return. By the 1,950 West Germany's democratic government included dozens of former POWs who'd learned about constitutional democracy, not from textbooks, but from living within it. The program's most profound legacy was philosophical. It demonstrated that ideology could be defeated not through punishment, but through prosperity, not through humiliation, but through humanity. The contrast method, simply showing people a better way of life, proved more effective than any re-education program. "We thought we were the master race," Burckhardt wrote in his memoir, published in 1973, "but we were mastered by kindness. We thought strength meant domination, but America showed us strength meant having so much you could afford to be generous. We confused fear with respect, cruelty with power. The Americans taught us, without meaning to, that a nation's true strength is measured not by what it can destroy, but by what it can afford to give away." The mathematical truth was simple and devastating. America could feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its heroes. This wasn't propaganda, it was grocery store receipts, farm production records, the caloric math of abundance versus scarcity. In his final diary entry from Camp Hirn, dated the 7th of December, 1945, 4 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, Burkhart wrote, "The lights of Texas showed me a world built not on fear but abundance, not on hatred but pragmatism. I came here as a soldier of the Third Reich. I leave as a man who has seen what humans can build when they choose creation over destruction. The camp's gates will open soon, and we will be free to return to a Germany that exists now only in ruins and memory. But I have been free since the day I stopped fighting the truth and started learning from it. America conquered us not with armies but with ice cream, not with bullets but with abundance. They treated us not as monsters but as men, and in doing so, showed us the monsters we had become. This is their victory and our salvation. The war is over. The peace, the real peace, the peace of changed hearts, has just begun." The mathematical precision of that transformation, 425,000 prisoners, $0.95 per day, 511 camps, resulting in hundreds of thousands of ideological conversions, remains one of history's most remarkable examples of unintentional soft power. America had waged war with bombs and bullets, but it won the peace with beef and butter, conquering not territory but consciousness, proving that the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of democracy was democracy itself.